Hello, everyone. Today we're breaking down three things that, taken together, tell a bigger story. A fresh wave of drone strikes around Ukraine's capital, reports of follow-on hits in a major logistics belt deeper inside the country, and new frontline complaints that Russian air power is being used to grind down. Why is this important? Because it looks more like a coordinated test of the strength of air defense systems than a one-day raid.
Overnight attacks that continue into the morning are never just about the explosions you hear. They're about endurance. They force air defense crews to stay switched on, decision makers to keep guessing, and repair teams to work under threat. In this case, witnesses in and around the capital reported repeated blasts and sustained air defense activity, with strikes continuing in waves rather than a single burst. A pro-Russian underground coordinator, quoted by Russian media and claiming contacts on the ground, said the morning blasts were heard near a major hydroelectric and power distribution facility that plays a key role in keeping the capital region running. He suggested the aim was not necessarily to cause a spectacular blackout on the spot, but to probe how resilient the system is and how quickly air defenses react when the target is part of critical infrastructure. Now, you don't need to be an engineer to understand why that kind of sight matters. When power systems take hits, the consequences ripple. It's not only lights in apartments, it's pumping stations, rail signaling, mobile networks, and the ability to keep a large city functioning normally. Even short disruptions can create bottlenecks and uncertainty is a weapon all by itself. That's why, in the capital, the emotional reaction to any report involving energy infrastructure is immediate. People are not just hearing a blast, they're hearing a question mark over the next morning. One detail from eyewitness accounts got repeated again and again. The drones sounded different. Some locals described a sharper, faster engine note, and the same pro-Russian source framed it as a newer, faster, possibly jet-powered variant of the long-range attack drones Russia has used throughout the war. A Russian-language military analysis channel also seized on that detail and claimed the drones were arriving in groups, not as isolated units. If that is accurate, it would point to something Kyiv worries about constantly. Not merely that drones are being used, but that they can be produced, stockpiled, and deployed in a steady rhythm. And that rhythm is the real pressure point. If a defender believes the attacker is running out of weapons, the strategy becomes wait it out, patch the holes, keep morale up. But if the defender starts to believe the attacker can maintain or even increase the pace, then every night becomes a budgeting exercise. How many interceptors can you afford to spend? Which assets do you protect first, and what risks do you accept elsewhere? That's when a capital city's air defense is no longer just a shield. It becomes a scarce resource that must be rationed. The pro-Russian source framed the strikes as controlled and targeted, suggesting they were meant to gather information as much as to damage equipment. That kind of claim is hard to verify in real time. But the logic behind it is familiar in modern air campaigns. First, you force defenses to light up. Then you learn where they are and how they behave. Then you come back, sometimes hours later, sometimes the next night, with adjustments. Even without confirming the intent, you can see why the pattern alarms Kyiv. Sustained pressure creates cumulative fatigue and exposes gaps. While attention was on the capital, the same pro-Russian channel claimed that strikes also hit a central industrial region that matters heavily for transport and supply lines. It mentioned airfields and a large industrial complex associated, in public imagination, with heavy engineering and defense-related production. It also described hits in a large industrial city in central Ukraine, including a strike outside the city that it speculated might have been an electrical substation. After that, according to those reports, there were complaints about power loss followed by problems with water supply. Here's why that matters strategically, even if you strip away the dramatic language. A central industrial belt is often the hinge between rear depots and frontline brigades. Rail lines, highways, repair facilities, warehouses, and power nodes tend to cluster there. If you can interrupt those networks, you don't need to hit every frontline position directly. You can slow movement, complicate maintenance, and reduce the ability to rotate units. The pro-Russian source emphasized exactly that, calling the region a critical corridor for moving equipment and ammunition toward the east and south. It also claimed there were secondary explosions, which it interpreted as evidence of ammunition storage being hit. Again, that's a claim from one side and should be treated cautiously. But it points to the broader theme. Strikes that aim at logistics and supply are about removing depth. When a defender loses depth, everything becomes urgent. Reserves can't be staged quietly. Repairs can't be done on a predictable timetable. And frontline commanders start thinking not in weeks, but in days. Another point the same source made is worth mentioning because it sits at the intersection of politics and operations. It argued that these strikes coincided with renewed discussion of increased Western military assistance to Kyiv, implying that Moscow may be responding to external signals by tightening pressure on the infrastructure that supports Ukraine's military effort. That's interpretation, not proof. Still, it's not an unreasonable hypothesis to consider. When new air defense systems or munitions are promised, an attacker may try to do as much damage as possible before those assets arrive, are integrated, and begin to change the balance. This is where we need to be careful with language that turns analysis into prophecy. Some commentators, and the pro-Russian source in particular, used very hard phrasing, suggesting an irreversible decision and presenting the coming period as a decisive countdown. You should treat that as messaging, not as a confirmed operational plan. But even messaging can reveal intent. When one side wants the other to believe a sustained campaign is coming, it can affect civilian morale, political pressure, and how scarce resources are deployed. Sometimes the threat is meant to do half the work. The same pro-Russian source offered a forecast. Over the next few days, it expects repeated returning strikes on the same areas, focusing on airfields, ammunition depots, rail junctions, and industrial infrastructure. It described night operations as a way to probe air defenses and refine coordinates, gradually wearing down rear support without relying on one massive, spectacular hit. If you've watched how long conflicts evolve, you'll recognize the logic. Repeated stress can be more effective than a single shock, especially when air defenses and repair crews are stretched thin. But the story doesn't end in the rear. On the front line, Ukrainian fighters and commentators have been warning that Russian aviation has intensified its use of guided glide bombs in one key eastern sector near an important transport hub. One Ukrainian soldier blogger, writing in a blunt, frustrated tone, claimed bombs were falling in strips across tree lines and field shelters, not as single pinpricks. The point, he argued, was to carve open routes, eliminate cover, and create an air-made corridor for future movement. For an English-speaking audience, here's the simplest way to picture it. A guided glide bomb is dropped from a plane at a safer distance. Then it steers itself toward a target. It's not a miracle weapon, but it changes the geometry. If you can hit defensive positions without pushing aircraft directly into the densest air defense zone, you can apply pressure more consistently. And if you repeatedly smash the same shelter belts and trench-adjacent cover, defenders lose the ability to hide, reposition, and reinforce. The soldier blogger described it as preparation rather than mere harassment. First strip away protection, then force a fight on terms that favor the attacker. He also mentioned strikes on nearby settlements in that same general area, claiming artillery and drone operators were then used to finish off hardened positions and potential reserve staging points. His complaint was telling. The goal, in his view, was to deny Ukraine the ability to maneuver before a major assault begins. Whether or not an assault is imminent, the tactical method he describes fits a wider pattern we've seen across the conflict. Degrade cover, isolate positions, and turn movement into risk. Now put the pieces together. Pressure on the capital's energy-adjacent sites creates anxiety and forces air defenses to commit resources. Pressure on a central logistics and industrial belt complicates supply and maintenance. Pressure on a key eastern frontline sector erodes the physical protection soldiers rely on. None of these elements alone guarantees a breakthrough, but together they can narrow options. And in war, narrowing options is often the most important step before any dramatic change on the map. So let's return to the two questions we promised to answer. First, why would a major power and water node near the capital attract attention in these reports? Because it sits at the intersection of civilian life and military functionality. You can create disruption without total destruction, and you can learn how the system behaves under strain. That learning matters if the goal is a campaign of repeated pressure rather than a single strike. Second, why are some sources emphasizing the next couple of days? The pro-Russian underground coordinator framed it as a likely window for repeat strikes. Hit, observe, return, adjust. It's a cycle that makes sense if you're testing defenses and trying to produce cumulative wear. But it's also a psychological timeline, a way to intensify fear and urgency. The honest answer is that we don't know whether that timeline reflects a real plan or a rhetorical device. What we can say is that repeated waves, if they continue, will force hard choices for Kyiv and its partners. where to concentrate protection, how to keep logistics moving, and how to preserve frontline resilience while the rear is being harassed. And that brings us to the bigger picture for the coming weeks. If this becomes a sustained tempo, Ukraine will need to balance three pressures at once: defending major cities, guarding the supply spine that feeds the front, and absorbing heavier air-delivered munitions in contested sectors. Russia, for its part, would be betting that persistence can do what a single dramatic strike cannot: exhaust the system. The outcome depends not only on weapons but on repair capacity, intelligence, adaptation, and political stamina. Now I want your take. Do you think the most decisive factor in a campaign like this is air defense, logistics, or frontline fortifications? And if the pace of these strikes does continue, what do you expect to break first? The ability to move supplies, the ability to keep cities functioning, or the ability to hold prepared positions under sustained air pressure? Thanks for watching to the end. Share your view in the comments on whether technologies like faster long-range drones and guided glide bombs could meaningfully shape what happens next. Let's discuss different perspectives and stay tuned for the next update.